Hey guys, tonight we lie back in the quiet ache of a room just a little too dark, too still, where the hum in your chest might not be the fan, but something else entirely. You felt it before, under fluorescent lights in grocery stores, scrolling long after midnight, or after a moment of laughter that dissolves too quickly. It's a hunger you don't talk about because you're not even sure what it's for. But it's always there, just behind your ribs. You might not spiritually survive this, just saying. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're still with me, drop your location and the local time. I like to know who else is wandering the desert with me tonight. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You feel it again as you lie there, the ache. Not physical, not emotional in the normal sense. It's deeper, older, and worse, it doesn't make sense. You've eaten, you've slept, you're not exactly unhappy, but something is missing. And it's not new. It's been humming beneath your skin since you were 12 or 6, or maybe since the very first time you realized your body could want something that your mind couldn't explain. The early Christian monks knew this hunger well. In the Egyptian desert around the 3rd century, they gave it a name, epithemia, deep, unsatisfied desire. They left cities and families behind, not because they hated life, but because they couldn't ignore that ache. They believed it pointed toward God, like smoke to fire. But first, they had to name it. You, though, you never named it. Not really. You called it boredom, or stress, maybe even lust. But naming something lust doesn't make it go away. If anything, it grows teeth. Still, you gave it a box, and when it crept out, you shoved it back in, hard. Historians still debate whether the early monks were suppressing something holy or healing something toxic. Some say their radical isolation caused hallucinations and psychosis. Others argue they encountered God in ways we can't comprehend, precisely because they listened to the hunger, rather than muting it. You remember being told it was sinful, the wanting, as if desire itself was an infection. You weren't supposed to ask questions about that, so you learned to hide it, to pretend the ache wasn't there. You watched others do the same. Everyone walking around as if they were full, when you could see in their eyes they were starving. But what if, just for tonight, you let yourself look at it? It's not always sexual, this hunger. Sometimes it's spiritual. Sometimes it's the craving for someone to see you, really see you, and say, "You're not broken." Sometimes it's silence. Sometimes it's meaning. But when no one helps you name it, lust becomes the easiest shape it can take. It's the loudest, the most accessible, the most distracting. By the 5th century, a monk named John Cassian wrote of logismoi, mental thoughts or suggestions that come in waves, especially for those trying to live in holiness. Lust, he said, was not the strongest of these, but it was the most persistent. His advice? Don't panic. Don't indulge. Just notice it, as if the thought was a cloud, not a command. You think back to that one time, no, the other time, when the hunger didn't feel dirty. It felt like longing for something real, and you were afraid, not because it was bad, but because it was good, too good, maybe too sacred. So instead, you redirected, you distracted, you numbed, you scrolled, and the ache, patient as ever, returned the next night. Remember when we talked about Roman sunscreens made of crocodile dung? Okay, we didn't. But yes, that was real. The ancients went to absurd lengths to shield themselves. In the same way, you've covered your ache with the most bizarre things: productivity, sarcasm, apps, half-read theology books, even hyper-spiritual fasting. But what if the ache isn't a threat? What if it's a knock? Some mystics believe the soul is born hollow and that everything we call sin is just a desperate attempt to fill it, not out of rebellion, but because the emptiness hurts. St. Augustine famously wrote, "Our hearts are restless until they rest in you." But he didn't say that rest would feel painless. In fact, he chased women and ambition for decades before that ache led him home. And you're here, lying in the dark, listening to someone whisper about hunger while yours sharpens just under your ribs. You may not know its name yet. That's okay. Tonight, we start by simply feeling it. That quiet pull behind your sternum, that place that tightens when you hear a certain kind of music or see a certain look on someone's face or dream a dream that doesn't quite fade by morning. That ache, it has a name.
You've tried to kill it. Don't look so surprised. You've launched 1,000 tiny wars against this ache. Rituals dressed as routines, commitments disguised as discipline. You called it self-control or reset season, like the ache was a bug you could debug if you just stayed busy long enough. And it almost worked. Almost. Remember that one week, maybe during college, maybe just last spring, when you finally stuck to the schedule? Cold showers, no screens after 9, daily journaling, 3 gratitude lists, and you even gave up caffeine. You thought you'd cracked the code, but the ache didn't leave. It simply went quiet, patient, like a fox in the hedges, waiting. Turns out, it's been watching you the whole time. In the 4th century, Christian hermits like Saint Anthony wandered the Egyptian desert to escape the noise of the city. They were some of the earliest known people to intentionally isolate themselves for spiritual clarity. But the wilderness didn't remove their temptations. It turned them into mirrors. Anthony himself claimed to have been tormented for weeks by thoughts that seemed to come from nowhere. He didn't fight them by shouting or panicking. He just stayed. He endured. You tried to stay too, for a little while. You blocked websites, you skipped parties, you filled your phone with podcasts and ambient whale noises. But slowly, the ache slipped back into your mornings, then your prayers, then your dreams. And when it returned, it brought shame with it, because you weren't supposed to still be hungry, right? That's what they told you. That if you followed the right path, obeyed the right verses, did the right things, desire would die. They promised you silence, and instead, you got a storm. There's a lesser-known anchorite from 6th century Gaul named Romanus. He tried to wall himself into a stone cell to avoid temptation, literally sealing the door behind him. But even from behind brick and prayer, he reported dreams so vivid and persistent that he once thought the devil had crawled into his mattress. Centuries later, some scholars suggest Romanus might have been suffering from sensory deprivation or latent trauma. But others, they believe he'd reached the thin place where your soul and your wounds collide, and only God can speak. Either way, his struggle didn't stop because he tried harder, and neither did yours. It's funny, isn't it? You can build the perfect life, a neat apartment, 2 monitors, a vitamin stack that glows in the dark, but the ache doesn't care. It seeps into your thoughts during Zoom calls. It lingers in parking lots after church. You can't predict it, you can't always trace it, and worst of all, you can't force it to leave. Some modern theologians argue that our desire for pleasure, even sexual desire, isn't inherently broken. It's simply disordered, that is, aimed at the wrong thing. But correcting that aim isn't like flipping a switch. It's more like learning to walk again after a long sleep. Clumsy, painful, slow. But slow doesn't mean failed. You don't talk about the times it returned after a season of victory. You don't tell people how defeating it is to feel clean 1 month and back at 0 the next. You keep that quiet because maybe if you don't say it out loud, it doesn't count. But it does. The ache doesn't vanish just because you buried it under apps and affirmations. It waits because it knows something you don't. It knows you're not fighting desire itself. You're fighting the wrong source. Do you remember that weird thing people used to say about St. Jerome, that he translated the Bible into Latin from a cave in Bethlehem, all while tormented by impure thoughts? Some even say he hallucinated Roman dancing girls on the cave walls. Whether that's historical fact or theological gossip, the point stands. Even a man translating scripture in the holiest place imaginable couldn't outrun the ache. Because maybe it's not supposed to be outrun. Maybe it's supposed to be understood. A friend once told you to imagine the ache as a fire alarm, not an enemy. It doesn't mean you're broken. It means something important is missing, or calling, or cracking, something deep, something old. You've tried to kill it with willpower. You've tried to silence it with content. You've tried to distract it with productivity. But what if it's not here to destroy you? What if it's here to lead you? Don't worry, we're not there yet, not tonight. But you're closer than you think. And the ache, it knows.
The problem with the ache isn't just its persistence, it's how familiar it starts to feel. Like background music in a cafe you visit too often. You don't notice it anymore, until it changes key. Tonight, you lie awake, again, not because you're indulging it, but because you're trying to understand it. You keep thinking, if God knows my heart, if He made me, then why this? Why now? And somewhere inside, you whisper a more dangerous question. What if He let this happen on purpose? You've heard sermons that promised purity as reward, obedience as immunity, but the ache didn't vanish when you obeyed. Sometimes it got worse, more cunning, more intimate. And that's what messes with you most. Because if you did everything right, then who's really in control? Let's pause here for a moment and consider the 14th century mystic Julian of Norwich. Yes, that's her actual name. She was an anchorite too, walled into a cell by choice, speaking to visitors through a small window. She described visions of God showing her a little thing, the size of a hazelnut, which she understood to be all of creation held securely in his palm. Now, whether you believe she truly saw visions or not, there's something curious in her theology. She insisted that God permits certain struggles not in cruelty, but in love. Because through the pain, the ache, the longing, something eternal is forged. That's not the message that gets a lot of airplay these days. You were told to cast your burdens away, to flee temptation, to declare victory. But no one mentioned what to do when your prayer feels like silence, or when you quote a Bible verse and the urge just laughs. Maybe that's why you avoid eye contact with God when you pray now. You say the words, sure, but part of you is suspicious He's not listening. Or worse, that He is, and He's saying no. There's a half-buried story in the Jewish Midrash, oral tradition from ancient rabbis, about the Israelites building the golden calf. One rabbi speculated that they weren't just impatient for Moses to return from the mountain, they were addicted to the certainty of idols. A God you can't see, can't schedule, can't manipulate. That was too terrifying. So they carved one they could control. And that fear still haunts you, doesn't it? Because the ache reminds you that you're not in control either. It makes you feel like a hypocrite. You scroll past an image and feel that jolt, half thrill, half shame. And then you wonder, what kind of person am I? You overcorrect. You delete things, fast, pray, reset. And still, the cycle continues. Because your soul is not a computer. It doesn't run updates overnight. Some scholars now argue that the early church fathers didn't view desire itself as evil, but as powerful, like fire, useful when tended, destructive when hidden. And that maybe, just maybe, the Christian life wasn't about eliminating the ache, but learning to live with it honestly. That sounds noble, right? But it's also maddening, because learning to live with the ache requires something you're terrified to offer: vulnerability. You'd rather confess to a crime than admit you're still lonely, still craving, still afraid you'll never get this right. And God, He doesn't seem in a rush. Which might be the point. There's a strange account of a 16th century Spanish monk named Juan de la Cruz, John of the Cross. He coined the phrase, the dark night of the soul, describing those seasons where God feels impossibly distant. Not absent, not angry, just quiet. Like he's letting the silence teach you something only the ache can reveal. Now, modern readers often interpret John's writings as metaphors for spiritual growth, but John never claimed the dark night was a metaphor. He lived it, cried through it, wrote poetry from within it. And you're walking through your own version right now. You wouldn't choose this ache. You didn't ask for it. But here it is, pulsing in your thoughts, coloring your prayers, shaping your habits. And somewhere deep down, you're starting to realize, maybe this isn't punishment. Maybe it's an invitation. No, not to act on the ache, not to surrender to it, but to ask why it's there, what it points to, who it exposes. And if you're still listening tonight, eyes flickering against the dark, trying not to wake your roommate or partner or cat, then you're already doing the bravest thing of all. You're not pretending anymore.
You wonder sometimes what it would feel like to wake up one day and not think about it. To not measure yourself against yesterday's struggle or scan the horizon for temptation like it's a weather report. Just wake up, make coffee, stretch your back, and be free. But freedom, as it turns out, is not always the absence of weight. Sometimes it's learning how to carry it differently. That realization hit you not in a church pew or a conference or even a tearful altar call, but one ordinary Tuesday when you saw someone else flinch the way you do. A subtle shift in posture, a hesitation before speaking, averted eyes during a conversation that got too real. You saw yourself, and it wrecked you. Because until then, the ache had been private. You assumed no one else carried it the same way. But here was someone else, not victorious or gleaming with self-discipline, just surviving. And something about that shared fragility was holy. It reminded you of that ancient idea from the Desert Fathers, the early Christian hermits who fled society to live in silence and prayer. They had a word for the temptation that visits most often, logismoi, which means disturbing thoughts. They taught that you don't banish logismoi by willpower alone, but by naming them, not acting on them, not denying them, just saying them out loud. Try that in your next prayer and see what happens. There's a story from that era, probably exaggerated as old stories are, about a monk who confessed to his elder that he kept dreaming of wine and women. The elder didn't scold him. Instead, he handed him a shovel and said, "Come, let's plant a fig tree." It took years to bear fruit, but when it finally did, the elder brought the monk a cup of wine made from those figs and said, "Drink, but remember who you were when we planted this." Maybe that's what God is doing in you, planting something slow, rooted, deep. Of course, you hate that idea because you want instant healing. You want a holy switch to flip. You want someone to lay hands on your head and speak in tongues and erase the past. And honestly, sometimes you want it because you're tired of being human. But God doesn't want you to stop being human. He just wants you to be fully human. And that means not skipping over the struggle, but growing through it. Not replacing the ache, but reframing it. Not pretending you're someone else, but learning how to be you in the light. Modern psychology now agrees with something the ancients already knew. Suppression fuels obsession. What you exile in the dark returns stronger. But when you bring it into relationship, into community, into honesty, that's where healing begins. Yes, it's terrifying, but it's also where courage is born.
You've started noticing things differently lately, haven't you? You hear a worship song and you don't just sing it, you wonder if the person writing it also struggled like you. You read scripture and don't just skim the victories, you start paying attention to the mess. David's failures, Peter's denial, Paul's thorn. And maybe the biggest twist in this whole saga? God seems strangely unfazed by the ache. Not apathetic, not cruel, but patient. He hasn't zapped it out of you. He hasn't revoked your worth. He hasn't rewritten your story. Instead, he walks with you in it, not hovering above, but stepping through it beside you, sandal by sandal. You remember that passage in Genesis where Jacob wrestles an angel through the night? Some scholars think it wasn't an angel at all, but God himself. And Jacob walks away limping, marked, but blessed. That story used to confuse you. Why would God wrestle someone in the dark? Why wouldn't he just show up in daylight with a plan and a latte? But maybe that's the point. Maybe God meets you most deeply in the wrestle, when your limbs are tired, your heart is bare, and your prayers don't sound like hymns. They sound like grunts. And maybe you're finally learning something Jacob didn't realize until sunrise. The limp was the gift, because the limp proved the encounter was real. You limp now too, in memory, in mind, in the slow way you learn to pray with your full self, not just your Sunday self. And in that limp, you're learning how to walk free, not because the ache is gone, but because you've stopped running from it. Freedom, it turns out, isn't always deliverance. Sometimes it's deeper than that.
You don't always notice the shift when it's happening. It sneaks in quietly, like dawn, not with trumpets or fanfare, but with a subtle change in how you carry yourself. The shame doesn't leave all at once, it just stops being the loudest voice in the room. And one day, you realize you haven't apologized to God for existing in a while. You've started talking to him like he's still here, like he hasn't given up on you. Like maybe, just maybe, he knew what he was doing all along. That's a strange thought, isn't it? That the God who formed galaxies also accounted for your missteps. That he didn't write your story in ink too fragile to handle your stains. That when he said, "My power is made perfect in weakness," he actually meant it. He wasn't trying to look poetic, he was giving you a survival strategy. And you've needed one, because the culture around you, even when it pretends to be helpful, keeps weaponizing your pain. Self-help gurus want you to transcend desire. Moralists want you to feel disgusted by it. And the algorithms, they want you to give in, again and again, until your soul is numb from overexposure. But God whispers something different. He doesn't say, "You are what you crave." He says, "You are who I love." There's an old Eastern Orthodox idea called theosis, the process of becoming more like God through union with him. It's not about perfection and behavior, but transformation through relationship. Fire doesn't turn wood into more fire by scolding it. It does so by setting it aflame. And slowly, that's what's been happening in you. You don't avoid the struggle anymore like it's a dirty secret. You face it with a strange, growing calm. Not because it's easy, but because it's known, named, held. You've found small rituals that tether you. A psalm you return to like a familiar scent. A walk in the early morning when no one expects you to be anything but alive. The sound of your breath when the world has gone quiet. A journal entry that doesn't clean up the mess, but lets it be seen. These are not victories in the traditional sense. You won't post them on a highlight reel or get applause, but they are anchors. They are evidence that the Spirit still broods over your chaos, not to shame it, but to create through it. You remember reading that St. Augustine once said, "Give me chastity, but not yet." And somehow that honest mess feels more sacred than all the polished testimonies you used to admire. Because he didn't lie. He didn't pretend. He just gave God the truth, raw and ragged. There's another detail about Augustine that most people miss. His mother, Monica, prayed for him for 17 years. 17 years. That's how long she waited while he wandered, wrote pagan philosophy, and lived wildly. She didn't nag. She wept. Quietly. Consistently. And eventually, something broke through. Historians still debate whether it was the mother's tears, the philosopher's own intellect, or sheer divine ambush that changed him. But maybe it was all of it. Maybe grace doesn't mind getting its hands dirty. You've started to believe that now, not just intellectually, but bodily, viscerally. You breathe in grace like oxygen instead of analyzing it like a theory. You accept that you are not God's project, you are His child, and He doesn't ask children to earn air. You still have days, of course. Days when the 8 sneaks in sideways, when you miss the comfort of old patterns, when you feel like a fraud in your own skin. And in those moments, your prayers get weird and small and full of run-on sentences. But they're real. And that's the only kind God has ever wanted. You imagine Him now, not as a judge behind a desk, but as a father on a porch, watching the road, not pacing, not frowning, just waiting, knowing. And when you do stumble back, He doesn't even let you finish your rehearsed apology. He runs, He embraces, He interrupts your shame with celebration. Not because you're flawless, but because you're home. And the longer you stay, the more you learn that even the struggle has become a kind of prayer, a strange, wordless way of staying connected, not to the ache itself, but to the one who meets you in it. You are not who you were. You are not yet who you will be, but you are becoming. And that, friend, is holy ground.
You remember the beginning now, not just of the struggle, but of the story itself. Before the temptations, before the endless cycle of guilt and apology, there was a time when you simply wanted to love well, to live meaningfully, to feel whole. Lust didn't begin as rebellion. It began as longing for connection, for beauty, for a sense of being chosen. And now, as you sit with everything you've walked through, something wild happens. You stop despising that longing. Because beneath all the mess, beneath the fractured impulses and poorly lit choices, was always a deeper ache. To be seen without shame. To be desired in a way that doesn't take. To be touched without disappearing. And you begin to wonder, what if God never hated that ache? What if He planted it? There's a quiet revolution happening inside you now. You've stopped asking, when will this be over? And started asking, what is this forming in me? And the answers come slow, like light through thick curtains. But they come. Patience, empathy, a kind of scarred wisdom, the ability to sit with others in their ache without rushing them, the gift of laughter that doesn't mock but disarms, the scale of seeing holiness in ordinary mess. You've become a person who doesn't flinch when someone shares their worst. Because you've seen your worst, and it wasn't the end of the story. That changes how you live. It changes how you walk into a room, how you hold eye contact, how you greet yourself in the mirror after a hard night. You stop looking for signs that you're fixed and start noticing the grace that keeps you breathing. You start giving it away. Not in dramatic gestures, but in subtle, subversive ways. A quiet nod when someone confesses, a pause before judging,
a habit of praying for strangers you'll never meet. These are the fruits of a soul that has tasted mercy and cannot forget the flavor. There's a historical footnote from the Desert Fathers, a group of Christian monks in the 4th century who fled into the Egyptian wilderness to wrestle with God. One of them, Abba Moses, was known for his past as a thief and murderer, and when others tried to shame him for his history, he famously brought a leaky jug of water to a meeting and said, "My sins run behind me, and I do not see them." He became known not for his failures, but for his mercy. The early church didn't make saints out of the perfect. It made saints out of the painfully honest. That idea sticks with you now, because your story isn't a detour. It's not the unfortunate chapter before the real spiritual life begins. It is the real spiritual life. It's the soil where your compassion grows, the kiln that fires your courage, the ink with which your future prayers are written. And yes, there are still hard days. There always will be. But something's shifted. You no longer walk into battle thinking God is disappointed by your wounds. You walk knowing He's already bandaged the worst of them. You walk in borrowed strength, in absurd peace, in the strange dignity of someone who should have given up, but didn't. Not because you're strong, but because you're held. And now, finally, as the night settles in and your breathing slows, you feel it. That quiet invitation to rest, not just from the day, but from the weight you've carried so long. The struggle doesn't define you anymore. It shapes you, yes, but only into someone more open, more spacious, more alive. And somewhere in the hush between now and sleep, you hear it again, that divine whisper, "I'm not ashamed of you." And for once, maybe for the first time in forever, you believe Him.
So now, let it all go. Let your mind drift like leaves on a still pond. The images, the words, the weight of the day, all softening now, dissolving into the quiet. Your body remembers what rest feels like. Your breath, slow and rhythmic, becomes the only language you need. Each exhale unwinds the last thread of tension. Picture a warm field at dusk. The horizon stretches endlessly, soft and amber. A gentle wind brushes past, as if even the air knows you're safe now. You lie back, and the earth holds you. Not to test, not to judge, but simply to cradle you. Everything hard has softened. Everything loud has grown still. And in the quiet, something deeper than sleep rises. Peace. You are not alone. You have never been alone. Even here, especially here, you are known and loved and watched over. So let the last thoughts drift out like stars at dawn. Let the story fade, not into silence, but into something better. A stillness that sings, a hush that heals, a love that stays.